fight forward. And I say that this man has brought us also the referendum. So may I introduce Nigel Farage, who will now talk to us about the future of immigration in this country. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everybody. You might have noticed in the debate last night that the Prime Minister, in response to every question about open borders and migration, referred us back to the single market. It's the answer for everything. And it rather reminds me of the 1975 referendum, when the answer to everything was the common market. So we're being sold that this is all about trade, and that the single market is soft and cuddly and lovely like a baby puppy. But actually it's a smokescreen for what is the real, simple proposition that this referendum is all about. It's actually rather simple. Do you wish us to be a self-governing, independent, democratic nation, or part of a bigger, broader European political union? That is the choice before people in this election on June the 23rd. Now, the principle of sovereignty, the idea that we should govern our own country, is the reason this party was founded nearly a quarter of a century ago. And I joined it right at the start because I believed in it myself. I have to confess, for much of that quarter of a century, thinking that sovereignty was the most important element in our lives could not be described as much more as participating in a minority sport. But all of that changed in 2004 with the admission of 8 and then 10 former communist countries. Countries that were much, much poorer than us. Countries that in many ways had living standards, corruption standards, that still make me wonder how on earth we're in a political union with them. But what it did was it opened the doors. It opened the doors to a kind of migration into this country that we had never seen before. And it took a long time for people to make the link between European Union membership and what was happening in their communities. The answer, of course, is all too simple. It is the opening of that door that made people understand that what we used to know as a British passport is now a passport for EU citizens. And this passport is available to 508 million people, any of whom can come to this country. And I'm afraid that this continuing flood of people that is coming into this country has opened up a great divide in our society. On the one hand, we have our ruling classes who think that this new order is really rather lovely because it means cheaper nannies and cheaper chauffeurs and cheaper gardeners. And for those that own big companies, it's wonderful. It means lots and lots of cheap labour, and it's driven the cost of labour for everybody to the floor. In fact, for many years, what we've seen is the minimum wage effectively becoming the maximum wage. But what about everybody else? What about ordinary people? What about those running little businesses? What about sole traders? What about ordinary families in this country? Well, their life has fundamentally been changed, and their quality of life and the opportunities afforded to their children and grandchildren have seriously declined. And yet, people have been made to think that if they were to speak out against what was happening to them and their communities, they might get Gordon Brown being rather rude about them. Now, we're told by the establishment that it's okay. There's nothing to worry about because it brings huge economic benefits. Taxpayer-funded survey after survey tells us that migrants pay more in tax than they take out. So that's all right then, isn't it? Well, I'm rather sceptical about those figures, and I probably take the view that the House of Lords committee that looked into this probably got that equation about right when they said actually it was about even Steven. But what none of these surveys ever take account of are the capital costs to cope with a rocketing population. The capital costs of needing to build new hospitals, the capital costs of needing to build new schools, the capital costs of needing to build new roads. None of that is ever taken into account. But I put it to you this morning that actually this is about more than money, that we should measure our country, we should measure our quality of life, we should measure things not just in terms of GDP figures. The Chancellor would tell you that because our GDP is increasing every year, that's wonderful, and that's an excuse to maintain the open door. And I would say to you, there are some things in life that matter more than just looking at money. What matters to people is their quality of life, is the fact they find it increasingly difficult to admit their child to a local primary school. What matters to people is that in many parts of the country, you're very lucky to get a GP appointment within the space of a week, and in some parts of the country, it is much, much longer than that. What matters to people is that for people working on average salaries, their living standards have declined by 10% over the course of the last few years. And what matters to people, hugely, is the housing problem. We have, for the first time, a generation who cannot aspire to the same things their parents and grandparents aspired to, namely to be able either to buy a house or to get social housing. And it's a fact, a simple fact, and one that I think is going to resonate throughout this referendum campaign. We have to build one new house every 4 minutes just to cope with current levels of immigration. A new house every 4 minutes. It's actually not possible, I think, to build that number of houses, and it certainly could not be done without vast swathes of our countryside being built on, and indeed, I think the green belt itself would probably have to be sacrificed. And there's also concern, deep concern. You know, I met a lady in Bolton last week. She grasped my hands with tears in her eyes and said, "Why doesn't Mr. Cameron come to our street and see what he's done to our lives?" Why don't the press corps, I challenge you, go to Page Hall in Sheffield, as I did the other week, and see what the unlimited flow of people from Eastern Europe has done to fundamentally turn that community literally upside down. We're not against anybody. We're not against anybody, but we think it is irresponsible to have an open door. And if you have large levels of immigration coming in at the same time, there is no chance or hope of genuine integration happening. So it's no wonder that this is the #1 issue in this country, and that people out there are deeply concerned. In fact, I'd go a bit further than that. I think a lot of people out there are very, very angry. And yet, even the official National Statistics Office figures tell us that our population will rise by a further 4 million over the course of the next 8 years. And more shockingly, if current immigration levels continue to run as they are, and by the way, I think there's every chance they'll increase, because the Eurozone crisis is coming back, the Greek crisis is going to be critical through the month of July, let alone the problems that Italy is now experiencing as a country. But if we carry on with current levels of immigration as they are, the British population will be 80 million by the year 2040, and I believe that to be wholly unacceptable. Now, for many years, I've been saying this, and the problems just get worse and worse. And yet, I have been roundly condemned, castigated, made into a political pariah, sent to Coventry by the political classes of Westminster. I mean, not that that matters, I wouldn't want to speak to many of them anyway. Well done. But this was the week that changed everything. It changed everything in terms of this referendum, and I believe longer term, it's probably changed politics for good in this country. We saw last night on Question Time Frank Field very eloquently explaining that actually his poorer constituents have had a rough deal. I've shared platforms up and down the country with Labour's Kate Hoey, who has made very similar points. But in the course of the last week, we've heard Ian Duncan-Smith, we've heard Chris Grayling, and now we've heard Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Two of the guys who are favourites to become the next Prime Minister, and I suspect rather more quickly than most people think. But now they're all saying what we've been saying. They're all saying we want an Australian-style point system so that we can choose how many people come to our country and what type of people come to our country. And indeed, it's something I think that post-Brexit shouldn't just be decided by governments. I would like to see it debated in Parliament and voted in Parliament every single year so that the electorate can hold their own MPs directly to account at elections. So what was once considered to be wrong is now mainstream. And indeed, when I went for a cup of coffee this morning, Nick Clegg spoke to me, so there you are. He was really rather friendly. I couldn't quite work it all out. I think we saw this week the turning point in this referendum. People are beginning to understand that the Prime Minister cannot answer this fundamental question. He couldn't answer it last night. He won't be able to answer it next Tuesday, when I don't get the chance to have a head-to-head debate with him, sadly. But at least we get to share the same audience. Now, he can't answer the question, but when he says that we can maintain control of immigration whilst remaining a member of the European Union, people increasingly know this Prime Minister is simply not telling the truth. I must say, I don't believe a word that he says anymore. I really don't. So this is it. This may be the one and only chance we get to solve the biggest problem in the minds and in reality for the British public. It is this referendum on June the 23rd. And I think that now that there are lots of big voices saying this, I now believe this referendum will be won by the Leave side, and that's why I went to the bookmakers and put my money on yesterday. So we need a big, strong message. We need to recognise that our weak-kneed political class have given away everything that this country has ever stood for. That's what we must recognise, and we must fight this campaign. We must say, we want our passports back. We want our borders back. We want our country back, and we intend to make June the 23rd Independence Day. Thank you.